Hello, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Director's Cut, a podcast by the Directors Guild of America, featuring today's top directors sharing behind-the-scenes stories of their latest films and insights into the craft of directing. Please take a second to subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. This episode takes us behind the scenes of director Alex Gibney's new documentary, Citizen K. Photographed on location in the UK, Russia, and Germany, the documentary follows Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of the richest men in Russia who became known as the world-famous dissident Citizen K when he was imprisoned after a series of theatrical trials orchestrated by Vladimir Putin. The film tracks Khodorkovsky's path from communist to oligarch to political prisoner to exiled dissident and examines the price of power in Russia. In addition to Citizen K, Mr. Gibney's filmography includes the documentary features We Still Secrets, The Story of WikiLeaks, Freakonomics, My Trip to Al-Qaeda, the DGA Award-nominated and Emmy Award-winning Going Clear, Scientology and the Prison of Belief, and the DGA Award-nominated films Client 9, The Rise and Fall of Elliot Spitzer, and Taxi to the Dark Side. Citizen K was screened as part of the DGA's documentary series, which aims to spotlight groundbreaking nonfiction films for DGA members and guests by presenting screenings of documentaries as well as conversations with their directors. Following the documentary series screening of the film at the DGA Theater in New York, Mr. Gibney spoke with director Matthew Heineman about filming Citizen K. Listen on for their conversation.
Ooh. Just a light comedy from Alex again for us here.
Rom-com.
Yeah. I just sat through this and wrote down some questions, but I guess just start, Alex, by telling us, how did you come to the story?
I was looking for, after 2016, when American eyes turned to Russia, I was looking for something to do on the topic, and John Batzik and P.J. Van Sandvik, two of the producers, tried to interest me in the Khodorkovsky story. And I was interested, and I was interested because it seemed like an interesting, a good way to understand how power works in Russia through somebody who was at the very top, then at the very bottom, and now working sort of in exile. So that story seemed a way forward. And also, his life seemed to encapsulate the period of Russia that, there's a lot of undertow and history having to do with Russia in the Cold War. I don't think we know that much about Russia in the kind of the post-Soviet period, so that was also a kind of interesting way in for me. And Khodorkovsky seemed like a good story for that.
And in terms of getting to him and gaining his trust, can you talk about that?
Yeah, I met with him in a cafe just to talk about what this might be like, and told him that it would take a bit of his time, as a lot more of his time I think that he had bargained for. I think we shot for a total of 9 days, maybe 4 days before Russia, or 5 days before Russia and 4 days after coming back. For him, that was a lot of time, and it was. I think he's not Oprah. And it doesn't come easily to talking about himself or his emotional journey, but there was a lot he wanted to say about Russia. So over time, we got to a zone where I felt we were engaged, and he never he came into this knowing that he didn't have any control over the final result, which is not easy for a former oligarch. And also he never dodged any question. He may not have answered them in ways that were as thoroughgoing as I might have liked, but he always engaged on everything. I was impressed by that.
Did your perception of him change over the course of filming?
I think it did. Having read, one of the first things I did before I sat down for sort of 4 days solid of interviews was to read a tremendous amount and also to talk to a lot of people. And I really dug in on this period of the 90s. And he was a pretty ruthless character during that period. And I would say, there was more had more time, there was more stuff in terms of how he amassed his fortune that doesn't look so good. I mean, it was just a Wild West period, and people were pretty ruthless, and he was one of the more ruthless ones. So I came at him from that kind of perspective. But over time, I think the question that hangs over the film is, did he really change in prison? And I think he did. I mean, there's a line in the film, I learned that life is not so much about having, it's about being. It's hard for me to imagine, just taking one example, if Donald Trump were in prison for 10 years, that he would write something like that.
I think one of the things you do in all your films is you find these incredible characters and then you use them as a way to explore, larger topics. In the edit room, was it hard finding a balance between those two things? And can you sort of talk through that process?
The biggest challenge of this film was in the cutting, both in terms of finding a balance between present and past, and finding a style that was both that was able to jump back and forth between present and past, but also to weave Khodorkovsky's story through elements of the larger story of Russia that I felt were important to tell. And it was, at our 4-hour cut, from which we didn't feel we could cut a frame, to its current length. It was kind of brutal getting there, because there was a lot of story to tell. So, we were at it for over a year in the cutting room in terms of trying to get that balance right, because too much history telling about Russia and not enough Khodorkovsky, and you lose the thread. Too much Khodorkovsky, and you don't get this broader sense of context. And we also found interesting characters, and we would follow them where they took us. This wonderful guy, Igor Malyshenko, the guy who was the NTV executive, who then ends up being, Ksenia Sobchak's campaign manager. I would look for those characters to perform more than one function. Sadly, he recently committed suicide, another, death in this rapidly growing body count of dissidents. But it was people like that we looked to be able to tell both the Khodorkovsky story and the larger story.
There's a lot of footage inside Russia in the film. Did you shoot that? And if so, how? Yep.
We went to Russia for about 3 weeks, and we had a very small footprint, and it was fun. We used a Russian crew. We didn't. I went there with my associate producer, Ophelia Harutyunyan, and she speaks Russian. She's Armenian. She speaks Russian, and we had, and the crew was entirely Russian. Very small crew, but very talented. The DP was a guy who was formerly a still photographer, but very much of a daring-do guy. He had, been on Greenpeace boats when they were brushing up against the Russian fleet, and he knew just how to navigate the situation. So, for example, when we spent some time in Moscow. This was in the winter, and so when we went to Nefteyugansk, that oil town, that's where all those big shots of the flame are, it was in the middle of winter, and some days it was 20 below. The good news about that was that we went out in our little car. There weren't a lot of officials guarding the oil fields. So, it was too cold. So, yeah, and then we ranged broadly to Krasnokomensk, where he had been in prison, and elsewhere.
Were you or are you worried for your safety?
We applied for visas to do what we did. I'm assuming that we were followed. We brought with us burner phones and burner computers, which we all had wiped when we got back. They were suffused with malware. But I think that we played it straight, and yet we also were kind of under the radar at the same time. So, I felt there was some risk, but it seemed, other crews had certainly shot there, and I think the decision to go with a local team was a good one.
I just have a couple more questions, and I'll open up to the audience. I love how you shot his interview. There's something that's sort of creepy about his eye line. And I still am trying to understand what it was creepy about it. But
it's two angles. The A camera angle is dead on. It's a kind of like the iDirect, but I use something called the Tonytron in honor of Tony Rossi, who built it. But it's just a wooden frame which has a mirror in it, so that I sit off to the side and we mask myself with Duvetine. And then so he looks at me, but he's looking into a pretty big device, so that he's looking in the camera, and then the other camera is a side angle. And it was actually shot on green screen. And I shot it on green screen because I didn't know where he was going to be and how we were going to get him. I insisted, he knew where the jacket and the shirt were. And then we looked for locations to match afterwards in terms of coming up with the backgrounds.
In the score, I loved it. It sort of oscillated between the sort of like Wild West thing going on, and then it had obviously a thriller vibe and this sort of like Russian nostalgia music. Can you kind of talk through the score?
The score was really fun to do. It was done by Ivor Guest and Robert Logan. Robert Logan is an Eastern European, and so he was the one who got the soul of that part of the territory. And they had scored Taxi to the Dark Side for me, and also Mea Maxima Culpa. But those were more sort of tonal films in terms of the score. This one was really kind of all out, and that's what we wanted. We kind of wanted pitched somewhere between a gangster film and a Western. I sort of, at times we sort of thought about this film as Once Upon a Time in the East. And that's how I wanted the score to be. And of course, there's some real Russian score there too that we used, and we wanted that music, but we wanted the music to play a very active role.
And my last question, then I'll open up, is what do you hope to say with this film?
I think it's meant to. It's never easy to say this is what I wanted to say, because you want people to experience a film and come out of it thinking more rather than, oh, I got it, it's this. But that said, we're living at a time when authoritarian ideals are roaming the land and taking root in a lot of countries. And so this was a look at Russia, which is kind of exporting that model to some extent, and also some uncomfortable parallels between Russia and where we might be headed if we're not careful.
I'm sure there are questions right here. So the question was, how there's 4 hours of the first co's, 4 hours. How do we get that? How do we get to that footage?
I always wonder about that. The amount of work that goes into something like this, particularly in the cutting room with a magnificent assistant editor. We had 2 assistant editors who plowed through enormous amounts of archival footage. We were pulling stuff off the internet, that song, I Want to Marry Putin. Somebody was just trolling the internet, and we found that. So there's a tremendous amount of material, and it was fun. I wish there were a way, without being sued, that we could put it up someplace, because it might be instructive for people. But of course, all that material we're getting in, we don't have the rights to use it and all of that. But it would be fun to think of a good way to make a lot of that material available, for people who wanted to see it, that wanted to dig further. We haven't quite figured out a good way to do it yet.
Right.
Look, sorry, do I have any hope for Russia? I mean, to some extent, Russians will have to take care of Russia. So am I pessimistic? Yes. Am I hopeful? Yes. One of the things that impressed me about going to Russia, and I don't consider myself a Russianist or a Russian expert. I think, I shot there for another film I did called 0 Days. I went there a long time ago when it was the Soviet Union. I took the Trans-Siberian Railway. But the one thing that always impressed me about the place, and even more so this time, was the number of, smart, savvy, tough, engaged Russians that I met. So there's got to be a way, and let's hope that the tide turns and things begin to shift. I can't say I have any easy answers for anybody, just hope for the future. and really that Russia makes its own way. It was interesting. Somebody asked Khodorkovsky in a Q&A session we were at, what can we do about changing Russia? And he had an interesting answer. He said, there's nothing you can do. It's up to us. Which, considering a history of interventionism, might be a good point.
Back here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I expected there to be more security around him. He has a view that if somebody from Russia is going to kill him, they're going to kill him. And it's not going to matter how much security he has. That said, he doesn't take chances so much when his family's around. Suddenly then security people do appear. But when we were walking around London and I kind of scanned the horizon, and we were walking around, getting into subways. He has that little backpack that, he's trucking with. I didn't notice any security, nor did he contact anybody. There's no, earpieces. He just goes rogue.
His family, was there talk about including his family in the film?
There was. Ultimately, I decided not to. I mean, there are brief shots of them, both in the past, that sort of barbecue scene inside his house where you can see his wife and, a little glimpse of his daughter.
Who was shooting that, by the way?
That was shot a long time ago. That was, shot in 2003, just before he went into prison.
By like a crew that he hired? Or
no, not a crew that somebody was making a documentary at the time. I mean, he was a pretty famous guy. So I think at the end of the day, he was reluctant to involve his family in it too much, and I kind of respected that, feeling that, this was a film, not a pure portrait of Khodorkovsky. And so, we touched on it from time to time, just to give a sense of the human dimension of the story. I decided not to engage with that so much.
I think we probably have time for one or two more questions.
Well, I mean, the whole relationship, obviously, the whole relationship to television I found very instructive. And the idea of trying to control television, or at least manage an image, and also that weird and eerie sequence where Putin suggests that the people responsible for the Skripal poisoning appear before RT on television, and they, rapaciously lie about visiting the Salisbury Cathedral and how impressed they were by its spire. And the way that's presented, which is, I think, magnificently described by the journalist in the film from The Economist, is right and feels very telling today, where you can tell a lie in plain sight. Everybody knows it's a lie. Your followers don't seem to care. Other people get worked up and in a high dudgeon about the fact that it's a lie. And there's a wink and a nod, and you just move on. And that was scary. That was a scary parallel for me. By the way, just one note of, wish I had been able to nail this when I was there, but it appears that through a group that's like Bellingcat. Bellingcat is a group that uses data from the web and stuff to pin things down with kind of eerie efficiency. People discovered that when Putin does these kind of vox pop things throughout Russia, where he goes and gets an ice cream from somebody, or pats the postman on the back, or says hello to a fireman, they did facial recognition software on those people and discovered there's about 8 to 10 actors who actually travel with Putin, who are cleared for security, and then they just change costumes. I'm going to be the fireman this time. So that I wish I had been able to include that.
Did you find, before we ask them, did you find yourself in the edit room sort of pulling back on the sort of, I'm sure, instinct to want to draw constant parallels between Russia and here?
I did. We did make a decision that we wouldn't mention the word Trump once. And I think that was important. I mean, in some fundamental way, there were parallels, but this is also a story about Russia. So I think we wanted to tell that story, and we didn't, there's a brief mention of the Mueller report in regards to Prigozhin, just to say, to give a sense of that. But in a fundamental way, while there was temptation, even while asking Khodorkovsky questions about the election and so forth, it was a temptation to go there, but we resisted that temptation. I think it was the right decision. By the way, I asked Khodorkovsky about the election, and what does his sources know about Putin and his attempts to interfere and advance knowledge? He said Putin had zero clue. He was as shocked as anybody that Trump won. They might. I mean, it's in terms of they wanting to take him out, it can get murky in Russia, and sometimes favors do get done, and I think we flicked at that. Whether or not a favor was done for Khodorkovsky, in the matter of the mayor, or whether favors were done for Putin in the manner of Nemtsov or Politkovskaya, that's a good question. And I think one of the interesting things about Russia is it's not a pure political dictatorship. It's a political leader surrounded by a lot of sort of oligarchs 2.0 who do favors for each other back and forth. And that's why I found it so poignant when I asked Khodorkovsky that question about what's Putin's greatest nightmare. I asked the question kind of in a broad metaphorical way. It surprised me that Khodorkovsky, of all people, would respond with something so concrete. The idea that the phones would all be turned off and he'd sense that the gangsters were coming for him because this guy was no longer useful to them. That, in a way, is one of the most poignant metaphors of the film, I think.
How can our friends and our family see the film?
Okay, so the film opens theatrically in LA later this month. It'll be at the Film Forum early in January, and ultimately around the world on Amazon. And by the way, it did have a screening recently in Moscow, a kind of private invitation-only screening, but it was there, though I'm told by Khodorkovsky that it is widely distributed in Russia completely illegally.
Where did they get the copy?
Hard to know.
Huge round of applause for Alex, please.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another DGA Q&A. You can find past episodes of The Director's Cut wherever you listen to podcasts. Stay tuned in the coming weeks for more great Q&As from directors Edward Norton and Melina Matsoukas. And be sure to subscribe, rate, and review us. We'd love to hear your feedback, and you can help fellow cinephiles find the show. Thanks again for listening, and have a great week. This podcast is produced by the Directors Guild of America. Music is by Dan Wally.